Australia's going to go in there. We're going to commit ourselves to net zero 2050. That's your take on what's going to be the outcome of this. It sounds like the Liberal Party and the LNP broadly have given up on the idea of fighting the fight, and that they're rolling over now and just saying, okay, that's it. We've got to follow. The world has shifted. We've certainly seen big business in the United States, massive amounts of capital coming out of big investment firms going into the renewables energy sector. The momentum is there. The world is moving in that direction. Should we just now accept that, go along with it? What are the downsides, and why should we resist anymore?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you like central planning, more regulations, higher cost of living, less freedom, less opportunity, and a deepening class divide, sure.
You mean socialism, do you, Ben?
Well, we've just...
That sounds like socialism to me. G'day and welcome to episode 71 of The Other Side with Damian Coory. The COP26 conference is coming up in Glasgow, Scotland in a little while. What is it all about? And what is Australia really committing to when it says it'll back net zero 2050? Are we heading for skyrocketing electricity prices? Will industry and jobs pack up and leave the country because of the cost of electricity and the unreliability of supply? And will Australia's commitment to carbon reduction make one dot of difference to the climate? Or is it all just for political show because there's an election coming up? Our energy expert Ben Beattie will join me as we explore some of the actual data and latest commentary on all things environmental. Before we get into our discussion about COP26, and we're going to hear nothing but net zero 2050 for the next few weeks in the news, no doubt, I thought it might be a good idea to get a reminder of the thinking errors that can cloud our judgments and those of our leaders about what we can actually do as humans to fix the world. Let's start first of all with a reminder of the way climate activists see the problem.
This is not about some expensive, politically correct green act of bunny hugging or blah, blah, blah. Build back better, blah, blah, blah. Green economy, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Net zero, blah, blah, blah. Climate neutral, blah, blah, blah. This is all we hear from our so-called leaders. Words that sound great, but so far has led to no action. Our hopes and dreams drown in their empty words and promises. Of course, we need constructive dialogue, but they've now had 30 years of blah, 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 and where has that led us? Over 50% of all our CO2 emissions have occurred since 1990, and a third since 2005. All this while the media is reporting on what the leaders say that they are going to do instead of what they are actually doing.
That was Greta Thunberg speaking at the Youth for Climate conference in Milan earlier this month. She's not speaking much about global warming since the temperature data isn't living up to the modelling. More on that later. She speaks about the CO2 levels, which are certainly rising. But if you ever doubted that the hyping of the climate crisis was just another great way to get us all focused on socialism and handing governments more power and having more centralised global control, I think the 18-year-old celebrity speaker removed all doubt in this speech.
The climate crisis is, of course, only a symptom of a much larger crisis. A sustainability crisis, a social crisis, a crisis of inequality that dates back to colonialism and beyond. A crisis based on the idea that some people are worth more than others and therefore have the right to exploit and steal other people's land and resources. And it is very naive to believe that we can solve this crisis without confronting the roots of it. We can no longer let the people in power decide what is politically possible or not. We can no longer let the people in power decide what hope is. Hope is not passive. Hope is not blah, blah, blah. Hope is telling the truth. Hope is taking action. And hope always comes from the people. And we the people, we want a safe future. We want real climate action and we want climate justice. Did you hear me? What do we want?
Climate justice!
When do we want it?
Now!
What do we want?
Climate justice!
When do we want it?
Now!
Climate justice? What is climate justice? Is it just that we rush to reduce reliance upon fossil fuels too quickly and let poor people suffer and die? And if the people in power don't decide, based on balanced assessment of all the needs of all people, who does? Greta and some kind of team of eco-fascists? Extinction Rebellion have shown themselves to be very reasonable souls. We should give them all guns and put them in charge, should we? In a moment, we'll look at some of the counter-arguments to Greta's lovely-sounding catchphrases. Some facts to challenge her blah, blah, blah. But first, let's hear from a grown-up about the risks of oversimplistic thinking. CO2 emissions are growing. There's no question about that. But whether that is a bad thing is not something all scientists and climate experts agree upon. Global temperatures are rising, but the ability to predict how fast they're rising and what the ultimate effects of that will be remain quite debatable and questionable. Now, I'm not saying that the move towards renewable and cleaner energy technologies is a bad thing. It's a great thing. I've got solar panels on my roof and I've got a hybrid car. I've never paid less for electricity or petrol in my life. I'm just saying that we need to remain skeptical and not be shut down when the self-righteous call us deniers, and we need to tread very carefully. A too hasty elimination of fossil fuels, that's fossil fuels, the things that led to a reduction of human suffering and enhancement of quality of life never before seen on this planet. We seem to forget that. If we're too quick to reduce them, that could cause real pain and suffering to us in the developed world and death to those in the developing world. If COVID and climate teach us anything, it should be that we treat scientific modelling with great caution. So as a counter to Greta, here's one of the cleverest thinkers of our time, Dr. Jordan Peterson, explaining a couple of years ago at Cambridge University why we need to be careful of the danger of believing that we absolutely know how to manage the effects of rising CO2 levels.
I worked for a UN committee for 2 years on sustainable economic and ecological development and read a very large amount during that period of time and learned a lot, much of which made me much more optimistic than I had been before I read the relevant literature, which was a real shock to me. But the climate change issue is an absolutely catastrophic, nightmarish mess, and the idea that that will unite us is that's not going to unite us. I mean, first of all, it's very difficult to separate the science from the politics. And second, even if the claims, the more radical claims are true, we have no idea what to do about it. And so, no. And besides, it's even worse than that. Here's one of the worst things about the whole mess is, so as you project outwards with regards to your climate change projections, which are quite unreliable to begin with, and the unreliability of the measurement magnifies as you move forward in time, obviously, because the errors accumulate. And so if you go out 50 years, the error bars around the projections are already so wide that we won't be able to measure the positive or negative effects of anything we do right now. So how in the world are you going to solve a problem when you can't even measure the consequence of your actions? Like, how is that even possible? And besides that, well, what's the solution? What are we going to do? Switch to wind and solar? Well, good luck with that. Just try it and see what happens. We can't store the power. Germany tried it. They produced more carbon dioxide than they did when they started because they had to turn on their coal-fired plants again. That wasn't a very good plan. Well, we don't want nuclear. It's like, okay, what happens at night? The sun goes down. Well, isn't that something we should have taken into account? Well, we got to flip on the coal-fired plants. Well, so it was a complete catastrophe, and all that happened was the price of electricity shot up. There's like zero utility. So that's not a solution. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we should cut back. We can't consume as much as we are all consuming. It's like, well, maybe, except the data that I've read indicate that if you can get the GDP of people up to about $5,000 a year, then they start caring about the environment, and the environment cleans up. So you could make a perfectly strong case, I think, and a reasonable one, perhaps even a humane one, that the actual idea would be to get everybody in the world who's poor, desperately so, out of poverty as fast as possible, which would increase consumption in the short term, because then they'd start to care about the environment and things would clean up.
And what is the best proven way to get people out of poverty quickly? Free market capitalism. When was the last time you heard a climate activist say, you know what we need to fix this problem? It's more free market capitalism, more innovation, more technology advances that will help us solve it once and for all. They never talk like that, do they? That's because most of them, not all of them, but the vast majority of the most green political people on the planet are also red politically. Australia's Greens Party, for example, is a very good example. It's not an environmental party. It's a socialist party wrapped up in green issues to make it look nice. Now, why do socialists like green issues? Well, because just like pandemics, they emphasize the moral case for big centralized government authorities taking more control to, say it with me, keep us all safe. Jordan Peterson went on to speak about the work of a man called Bjorn Lomborg, who wrote a book called How to Spend $50 Billion to Make the World a Better Place.
So what Lomborg did was gather a teams of economists, multiple teams, some of whom were Nobel Prize-winning economists. He had them assemble teams. He had them rank order development goals in terms of their return on investment, all of the teams. Then he averaged across the teams and came up with a final list. And addressing global warming wasn't even on the list. The most fundamental, he wrote a book called How to Spend $75 Billion to Make the World a Better Place, and that's not very much money on a global scale. Almost everything that he recommended had to do with increased child nutrition in developing countries. It's like, these things are complicated, man. These are complicated. It's like, well, let's fix global warming. It's like, okay, well, good luck with that.
That's Jordan Peterson speaking at Cambridge University back in 2019. Coming up on the 31st of October in Glasgow, Scotland, will be COP26, the big climate powwow. And to explain it all to us and give us a bit of a preview of what we can expect from COP26 this year is Ben Beattie, our energy expert and electrical engineer. Ben, thanks very much for taking the time to join us on the show once again.
Thanks, Damian.
Tell us quickly what COP22, why is it called COP26 for starters? I thought it was in Copenhagen, but it's not, it's in Glasgow.
Yeah, so COP is the Conference of Parties. So this is the countries that come together under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is the UNFCCC. Anything to do with this is all UN inspired. So it's a 26th meeting, 190 something governments, I believe.
Okay. So basically it's the United Nations body that sets the goals that we're trying to reach, right? All of these targets.
Yeah, they're trying to get the world, well, when I say the world, I mean some of the world, the developed world, to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. That's the entire point of the existence, and all these meetings where we get the private jets, of course, coming into these different countries with all the people, thousands of delegates, quite a carbon footprint itself.
So I sense the cynicism in your voice, my friend, and this is the other side, which is we're here to sort of present the other side of things. Why does an energy person like yourself not feel so great about this sort of a powwow?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we're being bullied, and more than a little bit. The reason I say that is, if we take a little bit of a step back in history, the 1997 meeting resulted in the Kyoto Protocol. 2015 resulted in the Paris Agreement.
The Paris Agreement.
Yeah, so which is 1.5 degrees C by 2030. Out of that, you get a whole lot of sound bites. You might remember AOC, the American politician, screaming at us, we only have 12 years to live. And we're like, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. And your biggest issue is, your biggest issue is, how are we going to pay for it? And like, this is the war. This is our World War II. It's only developed countries like Australia that have to take on these emissions targets, emissions reduction targets, and that's to allow developing countries like China to increase their emissions.
Okay, so we've got China with, I think it was 1,028 coal-fired power stations. Australia has a whopping 19 coal-fired power stations. Why should we be shutting ours down or not building any more when China keeps building them? What's their argument?
Well, the argument is that the UN wants the developed countries to reduce our greenhouse emissions to allow the developing countries room to grow their economies. I think that's a justification. It's not entirely clear. I describe it as the UN just wants Australia and the other developed countries to become China's carbon offset program, restricting our economies while China's economy accelerates. And I think there's a lot of questions in the world at the moment is why is China still described as a developing economy?
Yes, there is. That's a reasonable question to be asked at this point, I think. There was a great cartoon I saw recently, and it was essentially just, the politicians of the West shooting themselves in the foot voluntarily to appease the United Nations and this sort of approach. Some people might argue, though, that we've had our turn, that the developed world has had its turn using carbon and using through the industrial age and using up fossil fuels. And now it's the developing world's turn, and therefore we should reduce our emissions so that they can become advanced. There's also the argument that per million people, if Australia has 19 coal-fired power stations and China should have 1,028 because they've got 1.3 billion people, how do you respond to those sorts of arguments, and why do you see those arguments as wrong?
Former chief scientist Alan Finkel was quizzed on this in a roundabout way at Senate estimates one day, I believe, and he said that Australia's emissions don't make any difference at all to global temperatures. I think it's all pure theatre. So now that you've introduced me as cynical on the scheme, I'd like to read some figures off for you, if that's all right.
Go for it. Okay. Love data on this show. We love data.
Well, I'm well prepared for this one. So Australia's current emissions target as part of the Paris Agreement is to reduce from about 616 megatons in 2005 to about 440 megatons in 2030. So that 170 megatons is a 27% decrease. So that sits right in the middle of our 26 to 28% reduction below 2005 by 2030.
Okay.
By comparison, China's current targets will see them increase emissions from 10,000 megatons in 2015 to 14,000 megatons in 2030. So that's a 40% increase compared to our 27% decrease. So you understand where I get a bit skeptical about our role in global emissions. So that's in absolute terms. In relative terms, in 2015, China's emissions were 20 times ours. In 2030, on current targets, the Paris Agreement, and not just, this is a global agreement that 190 countries have signed to. In 2030, with our reductions and China's increases, China will have 30 times our emissions. So this is where the analogy of voting in a system falls down, because there's no way it's equal.
The critics are going to say to you immediately, though, China has 50 times our population.
Yeah, of course they do. That's
so
great.
Shouldn't their emissions be 50 times ours?
The problem with that is that a lot of these developing countries, and if you consider China a developing country, they have a lot of people who are trying to lift themselves out of poverty. India is in the same boat, and a lot of the Indo-Pacific nations are as well. The best thing for the world is access to clean energy. And by clean, I mean, I believe there's still 500 million people in the world burning dung inside timber huts. And that gives them lung disease and they die early. These numbers are pretty easy to look up on the World Health Organization. So that's dirty fuel. A coal power station, 150 kilometers away from a major center with appropriate scrubbing technology is quite a clean option compared to that. And if you want to talk clean, why not go nuclear? Why are we not supporting nuclear in these countries?
So, Ben, the whole idea of COP26 is to focus on net zero 2050. We hear net zero 2050. It's like carbon's going to be completely eliminated by 2050. But what does net zero 2050 actually mean?
Yeah, so I've been trying to work this out. And Tony Wood, he works at the Grattan Institute, and he's one of the leading energy commentators in Australia. He pops up all over the place, and he's quite a clever bloke. I heard him on one of your compatriots, Gene Tunny, on his Economics Explored podcast, episode 108, for anybody who's interested. And I think you'll provide a link later. But Tony goes on to describe what net zero is and why he thinks it's important. And I think it's a very interesting insight into how people see net zero.
And yet I'm not sure many people know what net zero means. What it literally means is that we have to return the global climate to what it used to be before the industrial and agricultural revolutions. That is, every ton of greenhouse gases that is put into the atmosphere by humans and other animals is taken out of the atmosphere by plants and oceans. That's it. And when we did that, when the world used to work that way, we had a stable climate. Now, what we've done is managed to screw that up over the last several hundred years. And the objective of net zero is to get back there. And the reason it's net is because it's pretty well recognised that getting back to absolute zero is almost impossible, if not effectively so. So that means we have to get as low as we possibly can, and then whatever's left above zero has to be offset with negatives. That is, taking emissions out of the atmosphere, which is a technology challenge in itself. The question is, how far can we get down towards zero before we have to start then offsetting what remains of our emissions with something else?
Okay, so that was Tony Wood speaking. He's from the Grattan Institute, which I think is sort of a centre-left think tank in Australia. And he was speaking there to economist Gene Tunny on his Economics Explored podcast. So, Ben, what's your take on what he said there?
Tony's take on this is the climate was stable prior to the Industrial Revolution. That's commonly defined as 1850, before the Industrial Revolution kicked off in England and Europe. My question to Tony would be, if we need to return to a stable climate in 1850, was there no droughts, floods, sea level rise, cyclones, or heat waves then? Is that the stable climate that we had prior to 1850? It was a perfectly sane and calm place where everyone was happy. And I don't think so.
Yeah. So, I mean, fossil fuels have enabled us to reduce fatalities from natural disasters and climate catastrophes as well, right? Is there a risk that if we go too fast, moving away from fossil fuels, that we're going to put people, particularly in poor developing countries, at greater risk?
The wealthier you are, the less emissions you generate, and the longer people live, the wealthier you are, the better education you have. The wealthier you are, the longer people live. The wealthier you are, the more your country can survive incidents. If you look at people like Bjorn Lomborg and Alex Epstein, they make this point quite well. There's risk in the world. In my opinion, there's greater risk from shutting off fossil fuels arbitrarily than there is in letting it phase out to something new, using the market as the mechanism.
So, Ben, I know that the Queensland LNP senator, who's, let's face it, really a National Party senator, not a Liberal Party senator, but he basically, Matt Canavan, he appeared on the Alan Jones show on Sky News about a week ago, and he had some pretty strong words about the impact that this is all going to have on our economy. Let's have a quick listen to that first of all, and then I'll get your comments off the back of it.
And last year, that modelling was done by a very eminent economist, Dr. Brian Fisher, used to head up the Agricultural Economic Agency, ABARES, in Australia. He ran the figures. You're absolutely right. He found a massive impact on the economy. He estimated that a 45% emissions reduction cut would increase wholesale electricity prices by 58%.
I just want to put that while you speak, this extract from the speech of the Prime Minister, put this up on the screen. This was made in 2019, 2 years ago. And the Prime Minister quoted, as you heard Matt say, BA Economics, along with the Business Council of Australia. There it is. And it says, now the work shows that compared to our government's targets, Labor's 45% reckless target and 50% reckless RET, renewable energy target, will, here he said, cost the economy an additional $472 billion. He said, I'm not kidding, $472 billion, almost $500 billion. It said it'll slash more than 336,000 jobs. He said it'll cut the average wage from what it would otherwise be by over $9,000 a year. He said that makes the carbon tax look like a mosquito bite. He said this thing is a chunk out of the people's living wages. It'll increase wholesale electricity prices by more than 58%. He said that's not a sensible target, it's a reckless target. And it'll come at a tremendous cost to Australians. Now, Matt, having said all of that only 2 years ago, how on earth can the Prime Minister now start contemplating 100% reductions?
Well, some Liberal colleagues are contemplating that, Alan, and it is absolutely absurd that 2 years ago we'd go to the election, get a mandate from people saying that, hey, if you were to cut emissions by 50% or 45%, if you were to cut them in half, it would put a wrecking ball through the economy, cost hundreds of thousands of jobs and put up your electricity bills. We get elected on that mandate and then 2 years later say, hey, by the way, you know what we told you about that 50% cut? We're actually going to double it and we're going to make it a 100% cut. And no, don't ask to see any figures. It's all going to be okay. Just trust us.
So, Ben, what do you think it's going to cost?
Oh, I think it'll cost our quality of life, to be honest. The government, Matt Canavan's right on the money there. He's very sceptical of how much the modelling is accurate. We've seen many models which come out which are not accurate. The government's recently been criticised for spending quite a lot of money on consultants. This stuff is all supported by consultants. The latest one with the Business Council of Australia, that was a Deloitte report they've released without the modelling. As Matt was so critical there. So
you would think the Business Council of Australia, of all organisations, right, and Deloitte would be, although Deloitte is notoriously known as the wokest of woke when it comes to consulting firms at the moment, but you would think that the Business Council of Australia would be on track. Wouldn't they? Wouldn't they be concerned about the impact of not having nice, steady electricity flow into our industry, causing factories to shut and manufacturing to leave our country?
Well, I don't know how they can stand behind this report. There's a few areas in it that just don't stack up to basic scrutiny. So off the top of my head, one of their figures was by 2030, the grid will be 85% renewable. Now, a quick back of the envelope calculation using capacity factors of wind and solar, we'd need to invest in enough wind farms and solar farms 8 times what we've done so far to meet that. And that has to be done in eight and a half years now. I mean, it's a very interesting proposition that they published that as quite interesting. So
I say that a lot of this can't happen unless we have the push though, right? So the argument from the renewable energy industry is that we've got to push this along and the government support must go into it.
Yeah, it's an interesting argument, right? So I would say to that, if nuclear power, the renewable energy lobby is constantly saying nuclear is hopeless, takes too long, and it's not economic.
Yeah.
Well, if nuclear power has to be economic, why don't wind, solar, and hydrogen? None of them are economic.
Yep. So we could actually support nuclear power and get a better result faster, do you think?
Well, imagine if we'd spent the last 20 years subsidising and targeting nuclear power. We would have a much bigger skill set funding of workers. We would have a stable electricity grid, the supply chains behind it, and top it all off, lower emissions. Hallelujah.
Yeah. So, okay. All right. So coming back to COP26, Australia's going to go in there. We're going to commit ourselves to net zero 2050. That's your take on what's going to be the outcome of this. It sounds like the Liberal Party and the LNP broadly have given up on the idea of fighting the fight, and that they're rolling over now and just saying, okay, that's it. We've got to follow. The world has shifted. We've certainly seen big business in the United States, massive amounts of capital coming out of big investment firms going into the renewables energy sector. the momentum is there, the world is moving in that direction. Should we just now accept that, go along with it? What are the downsides, and why should we resist anymore?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you like central planning, more regulations, higher cost of living, less freedom, less opportunity, and a deepening class divide, sure.
You mean socialism, do you, Ben?
Well, we've just...
That sounds like socialism to me. Also, I want to just get your thoughts on, everyone's talking about whether Scott Morrison should actually go to COP26. Malcolm Turnbull's going, so that will no doubt put the pressure on ScoMo to go, right?
I actually think ScoMo should send Matt Canavan to Glasgow. I think that'd be excellent.
Indeed, it would. Well, at least we'd see some fireworks. Okay, so where do we go from here? What's your recommendation for Australia? What should we be? If you were ScoMo and you were going to COP26, what would you be saying?
Right. This is my opportunity, is it, Damian?
Go for it. Yep. Get 30 seconds.
I would say no thanks to the Paris Agreement. I would ditch that completely. That's not good for our country. It's not good for our prosperity. I will be reaching out to other countries who are our great markets for resources, coal, copper, gas. That is Japan, India, the Asian countries, the Indo-Pacific. And I would say to them, let's join a partnership. Let's increase our wealth together and protect ourselves against the onset of globalism and expansionist developing countries.
All right, Ben. One thing I want to look at just quickly also is the September data. I like to do this around about every month. Have a look at the data coming out of the University of Alabama, I think it is, in Huntsville, the UAH data. This is the satellite temperature of the mid-upper atmosphere, I believe. So we now see that we're back up to 0.25 degrees Celsius in the positive above the 30-year average. We've been below it for a few months. This chart seems to suggest that, there is a trend of global warming, but it's very up and down, and we may be rushing to prevent it. At this rate, we're going to hit 1.5 degrees in 2200 by the look of it. So there's plenty of time to perhaps not panic. But can you just explain to me why people don't like this graph? I've heard complaints about this but not being, and it isn't the one that the IPCC uses, obviously, the UN's climate change body. Why don't they use it? What do they see as the weaknesses first, and are they valid?
You're going to get me labelled as a climate change denier, Damian. These are good questions. The UAH is satellites, and I think it's been going since the 70s. This does not show as great an increase in global average temperature as the data the UN uses. I think that's one of the reasons it's not in favour amongst the globalists, because it's just not as alarming. Like you mentioned, it's very small numbers.
But they always say that they look at the science. So what's their scientific argument for dismissing this?
That the people who produce it are biased.
And they're not.
Well, I think they're biased to try and sell their product. I don't know how much grants and things they work off, but I imagine there's some people who rely on their data and they have to pay for it. In terms of the data is a really good question when you're talking about global temperature. What is a global average temperature? And if you ever try and work it out, there's a lot of effort in trying to figure out how it comes about.
It's very, very hard for the average Joe in the street to really be able to kind of sift through all of this, because I think people are a little bit skeptical of the fact that, we seem to have the renewable energy push seems to be coming from money. It seems to be there's a big push towards this renewable energy industry now.
Money from governments and targets and subsidies. Right. Yep.
And then you see people like Malcolm Turnbull, whose son is very big in investing in this sector, and the family's very big in investing in the sector. And then he's all over the place on the political front. You've got Al Gore, I guess. I assume he's got investments in. Well,
these are the essentials, Damian. These are the people I think are going to end up in their cabals of 100% reliable energy, very expensive, and everyone else will be in a holding pen outside, just slaving away, Matrix style.
Okay. Right. Understood. Okay.
That's me at my most cynical.
Not too much of a conspiracy theorist for that one. Yeah, I hear where you're going from. But I mean, I'm not one to say that, look, you can't believe in something and then invest in it. I don't look at someone who's invested in a cause, like people who invest in the spreading of liberal messages in the media, for example. I mean, I think that's great. And if I ever get any money, I'll probably put it into expanding this show. So, I get that if they genuinely believe in it, but it does start to look a bit like, we're pushing a particular line here and we're not looking at all the data and we're not considering, and that anybody who kind of contradicts the fake 97% is shut down. And that's why I like talking to you on the show, because I think we can have a bit of a reasoned, critical look at things. And
you got to have a bit of a laugh about it as well. I mean, some of this stuff is pretty funny. I mean, the greenies won't like it when I say that, but genuinely it is. I mean,
can you share some of the humorous bits? Because I'm always up for a laugh.
I like.
We're talking about global calamity. Yeah,
maybe my sense of humor is. We'll see. We'll test it out now.
Yeah, go ahead.
I like to look at the sea level change, and you look at a couple of long-standing markers around Australia. The recent report from the Business Council of Australia said that Australian sea level is rising, and they don't provide any references or evidence of it. So I'm forced in my skeptical, humorous nature to go and look for myself. And you find the data, and you find that there's no trend of increasing sea level rise at Fort Denison. There's a spike where apparently the data was adjusted because of some movement of some sensor. Don't quote me on that, but everything goes along flat, and then in the 50s it jumps up 20 millimeters, and then it goes along flat again. If you go and look at who in the world would know about sea level change, the Dutch. So you go and look at their long-term data, and there's no acceleration for the last 400 years. So then you go and talk about, well, what's happening in Florida? Oh, the sea level rise in Florida. Yeah, because it's sinking. You look at the Maldives are building big airports on their islands, but they're not sinking. So I take all this alarmism with a huge grain of salt, because every time you scratch the surface and you ask questions, you either get told, don't ask that question, you're a denier, or you find contradictory information and it doesn't support the narrative.
So, Ben, what is going to be the solution? Nuclear is not an option. We're not allowed to do coal anymore. We're going to have wind and solar, and then we're going to have these periods of the day where we're going to have no electricity. Industry is going to leave. Our electricity bills are going to double. What on earth is going to happen? And how is the government proposing to get to net zero by 2050?
Well, we're going to make hydrogen and export it to the world. We're going to use hydrogen in steel production. We're going to use hydrogen in gas turbines to produce electricity. We're going to use hydrogen fuel cells in tractors, and we're going to use hydrogen fuel cells in all the transport industries. So this is the great green hope of the net zero is based a lot on hydrogen. Hydrogen itself is a regular product to produce. It costs about $2,000 a ton to produce from coal, but around $6,000 a ton to produce green hydrogen from water. And there's a whole lot of
that's how the environmentalists describe, or the scientists describe, the different types of hydrogen. If it's produced from water, it's green hydrogen. If it's produced from coal, it's bad. It's brown hydrogen, but it's 3 times more expensive when produced from water. So
yeah, that's right.
More tax dollars going into this.
You've got green hydrogen is electrolyzing water using wind and solar, maybe hydro and maybe nuclear, but that's not really going to happen in Australia unless we pull some nuclear in on some subs somewhere. You've got blue hydrogen is refined from gas, natural gas, and you've got brown hydrogen from coal. And that's currently how it's done most of the places in the world at $2,000 a ton. Twiggy Forrest made an interesting announcement just this weekend in Queensland. Yes. So I'm quite happy to see a billionaire investor, entrepreneur, mining magnate put his money where his mouth is and spend a bit of money up in Queensland with a manufacturing facility. That's a theory I can get behind fully. I'm a little bit worried about what's left unsaid as far as agreements with the state government. I'd like to know more about that, but there's obviously some commercial in confidence there. I'll just point out that the media has been announcing it as $1 billion hydrogen manufacturing facility. It's a bit of a beat up. The first stage of the factory will manufacture hydrogen electrolyzers, not hydrogen. Now, from his website, and I've got a little quote here, subject to customer demand, the total investment could be up to or in excess of $1 billion as orders firm for electrolyzers and other green industry equipment. The initial electrolyzer investment is expected to be up to $114 million Australian, with the first electrolyzer scheduled for production in early 2023. So you can see the ABC story was it's $1 billion investment, but it's not quite yet.
Okay. All right, mate. Finishing off, I want to just talk quickly about the Great Barrier Reef. There seems to have been an explosion of coral on the Great Barrier Reef. It's not allowed. It's supposed to be falling apart. What's going on?
Well, if you listen to the renewables lobby, everything's bad, don't go there. Pretty un-Australian, if you ask me. I'd be saying if there was an industry that needed a bit of help, especially in this lockdown age, send everyone there and go and visit it. I think what would happen if you went and visited the reef, you'd probably find it's pretty fine. Peter Ridd seems to think so, and he's spent a lot of time there.
Let's have a listen to James Cook University marine physicist, or former James Cook University marine physicist, I should say, because he didn't toe the line, Peter Ridd.
But it's actually at record high coral cover. We've got more coral on the Great Barrier Reef now than we did when records began in 1985. We've got twice as much coral as we had after huge cyclones went through the reef in about 2011 and 12. And this record high coral cover is despite supposedly having 3 catastrophic, unprecedented bleaching events in just the last 5 years. So you just got to wonder, were those bleaching events maybe as catastrophic as these experts supposedly claimed? And has there been just a little bit of exaggeration over the last, actually 50 years, because these claims of the death of the Great Barrier Reef, you can read newspaper articles going back to the 1960s and 70s saying the reef is dying from crown of thorns starfish or whatever.
Well, Peter, here's your graph. We'll put it up of the record high coral growth since 1985, so I'll put that up. But do you think they're kind of a little bit reluctant to tell us the good news reading that report, or are they kind of astonished? What do you think it is?
Well, yeah, they're certainly a bit reluctant. I mean, it's excellent data, and AIMS need to be congratulated for doing this work over the last 35 years. But they make an excuse, you see. They say, oh, we are at record. Well, they don't actually say record high coral cover, but we are. But it's only because the fast-growing corals, the plate and the staghorn corals, have got going. This is why we're at this high state. But of course, when we were at our record low in the 2012, they forgot to say, well, actually, it's just the fast-growing corals that get killed by cyclones, and they're also the ones that bleach, and they're the ones that get hit by crown of thorns starfish. So when we got the record lows, they were saying, oh, well, if we go on at this rate, there'll be no coral left by 2025 or whatever date they pulled out. So there's a degree of inconsistency, and it's yet another example where environmental science organisations have just been exaggerating and being alarmist. It's sort of a bit of a resonance with the previous segment. This seems to be a very common theme amongst the so-called expert organisations. Can you really rely on them? It's a very great shame, but in the case of environmental organisations, generally, I don't think you can.
Okay, that was Peter Ridd speaking to The Outsiders a couple of weeks ago when this news came out about the Great Barrier Reef. Once again, very hard for the layman to sort of make head nor tail of it all. But Ben, thanks a lot for coming on the show and helping keep us at least a little bit skeptical and questioning.
Thanks, Damien. If you're skeptical, I feel my job is done.
Okay, we'll see you soon.
See you, mate.
Hi, this is Damian Coory. If you enjoyed this episode of The Other Side, please like, subscribe, click every button and bell you possibly can on whatever platform you're on, and please tell your friends. That's the #1 way you can help us grow. If you'd like to join our VIP WhatsApp group and never miss an episode, because we'll send you a link as soon as they come out, just send us an email first on theothersideost@gmail.com. asking to opt in, and we'll add you to our VIP group. We'll send you a link so you can add yourself. It's a one-way group, not a chat group, so you won't be bombarded with messages or anything like that. And if you'd like to join the Discernible crew and get all the content from our platform, you can do that at discernable.io. discernable.io.